Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be taking you scuba diving around a small, remote island in the Eastern Pacific that I'm betting most of you have never heard of. It's known for huge schools of hammerhead sharks, it has legends of buried treasure, and it's the only island on Earth that reasonably fits the description of Jurassic Park. I'm talking about Cocos Island, also known as Isla de Coco. Cocos Island is located 300 miles southwest of Costa Rica, the country that controls it, about 480 miles northeast of the Galapagos Islands, and about 600 miles from the South American coastline. This makes it a perfect pit stop for migratory marine wildlife like hammerhead sharks and dolphins who need a place to eat and rest as they're traveling along this part of the Pacific. This location would also make it the perfect setting for a fictional park where we resurrected dinosaurs from extinction. If you remember in the movie Jurassic Park, John Hammond says,
"I own an island off the coast of Costa Rica."
Now, there are a few islands near Costa Rica, but Cocos is the only one reasonably large enough to serve as Jurassic Park. It's about 9 square miles in area, which is the same size as the part of Manhattan that's south of Central Park, or if you prefer, the part of Paris that's south of the Seine. Jurassic Park is officially about 3 times this size, but it's still the closest thing you're going to find in the real world. It certainly looks the part in any case. Despite it having the perfect setting for a dinosaur theme park, there's actually very little human development on the island. That's because the entire area is designated as a national park of Costa Rica, and the only inhabitants are park rangers. To date, there has been no evidence of any human settlements on the island prior to European discovery, so it truly is one of the most pristine tropical islands in the world. However, that doesn't mean it's been totally untouched by humans. Not only is it a prime location for marine wildlife to make a pit stop, but it also is a great place for sailors historically to stop, make anchorage, and get a source of fresh water. Because it was uninhabited, it also was a favorite location of pirates to store their buried treasure, the most famous legend of which is the treasure of Lima. Back in the early 1800s, Spain had control of Peru, but was slowly losing its grip to the local population who wanted their independence. The Spanish viceroy of Lima, sensing the unstable situation, sent all the city's treasure on a ship to Mexico for safekeeping. Unfortunately, the captain he hired for the job, William Thompson, was overcome by greed as soon as they got offshore, killed the guards, killed the priests guarding the treasure, and made way for Cocos Island. Once there, he and his crew buried the treasure, but shortly thereafter, they were caught by the Spanish Navy. The entire crew was hanged for piracy and murder, except for William Thompson and his first mate, who promised to lead the Spanish back to the treasure in exchange for their lives. However, once they made landfall at Cocos Island, they disappeared into the jungle and were never seen again. Many treasure hunters have been to the island since then, including one man who lived there for 20 years in search of it, but the treasure of Lima has never been found. Nowadays, the Costa Rican government has banned treasure hunting on the island altogether. However, it's not a total loss. The famous Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson was aware of the legend of Cocos Island and the treasure of Lima, and it was allegedly part of his inspiration to write the book Treasure Island, which, as a side note, was one of my favorite books as a kid. So although Cocos Island may not have any gold or jewels anymore, everyone agrees that its natural beauty and its unspoiled ecosystem is priceless. Jacques Cousteau, the famous oceanographer and conservationist, made several expeditions to explore its waters before eventually proclaiming that it was the most beautiful island in the world. So let's go to Cocos. After flying into San Jose, Costa Rica, I had to make my way over to the port town of Punta Arenas. I was a little confused about where my boat was, so I had to trek on foot across town, which is sweaty business under the Costa Rican summer sun. Luckily, I arrived just before everyone else did and didn't miss the boat. All of my fellow passengers turned out to be really interesting people, but many of them didn't want to be filmed, so I respected that. After the initial safety briefing, we had a 36-hour passage to the island. I've only been on a few scuba liveaboard trips, but I actually really enjoy the downtime of the first day, just to settle in, meet everybody, watch the sunset, and maybe catch a pod of dolphins on the horizon. In the case of Cocos Island, this is a necessity. There's no airstrip on the island, and so the only way to get there is by boat. And the Costa Rican government only allows a certain amount of boat trips to go there every year. So everyone on board was very excited because we knew we were about to experience something really special. As a bonus, we had beautiful skies and oceans the entire way to the island. Waking up on the third day, I opened the door to beautiful Cocos Island. It's hard to describe what it was like seeing it for the first time, but here we were, hundreds of miles from the nearest landmass, staring at this unspoiled tropical island of beaches, waterfalls, and the bluest water that I'd ever seen. The natural beauty on display was stunning. We had moored in Chatham Bay, which is one of the 2 bays on Cocos Island, the other being Wafer Bay. Scattered around the island were 13 dive sites of varying difficulty, but all of them were deeper than 65 feet. They could develop significant currents at any time and had varying visibility. By the way, I'm not going to go into explaining every single dive site because the plan was generally descend to a depth of 75 feet, hang out, and see what happens. Anyway, places like this generally demand that you're a somewhat experienced diver, and with 60 dives in my logbook, I was by far the most inexperienced person on the boat. Most other passengers had hundreds or thousands of dives in their logbook, but I've always felt very comfortable in the water, even in bad conditions, so I didn't let that intimidate me, which was good, because we did have some bad conditions. The first day diving, gorgeous weather. Our first dive site was called Manuelita, a small islet off the northern coastline. Immediately, I noticed so many white-tip sharks. These guys were ubiquitous throughout the entire trip, and we saw hundreds of them. Also, frogfish. These guys were hard to spot because they honestly look like an orange lump of rock, but I love them. There was also this juvenile Mexican hogfish that wanted to hang out with me for a bit. I have no idea why. Also, huge trumpetfish, so many spotted boxfish, and so much more. It honestly felt like I was diving in a giant aquarium. But of course, I was waiting to see what all of us had come to Cocos Island to see. Hammerheads. We caught glimpses of them in the distance, but being a shy species, it took them a long time to get closer to us. At the end of our dives, we generally ascended to our safety stop of 15 feet and floated out into the blue, which is kind of a scuba term for when you can't see anything but the water around you. That was my first time seeing sharks while floating out in the blue, and it was an exhilarating experience. Our first day of diving made everybody hungry for more, but weather had other plans for us. For the next 3 days, we had storms and rough seas, and let me tell you, I have never been diving in rough conditions like that before or since, but part of me loved it. You're riding out to the dive site on the dinghy, just hanging on for survival so the swells don't toss you overboard. Everyone's got their mask on already because the rain is hitting so hard, and then when you finally drop into the water and dive, it's calm, like the storm doesn't even exist. It's almost the same feeling of pulling a blanket over you while there's a thunderstorm outside, although it's a little bit more wet and a little less cozy than that. As every diver knows, though, poor sunlight above the water means poor lighting under the water. So most things we saw were just a dark shade of blue. Still, the wildlife didn't care about the storms on the surface, and we kept getting tantalizing peeks at hammerheads in the distance. Finally, on our 4th day, the weather cleared to beautifully sunny skies. We took this opportunity to do a little sightseeing around the island, checking out different cliffs, waterfalls, and caves. In the sunlight, the island was truly showing off its beauty, like the lost world that it is. During the tour, I couldn't help noticing that one clump of trees on a cliff looked eerily similar to a T-Rex. Jurassic Park indeed. With the weather improved at the surface, it only made sense that we would start having trouble underwater. We went to a dive site called Big Dos Amigos, which features this big 45-foot high archway you can swim through, which, with the lighting at that time of day, was just mesmerizing. However, once we got to the other side of the arch, we started getting hit with this heavy surge current. And if you're not familiar, a surge current is a current that kind of alternates back and forth in a rhythm. So it might push against you for a few seconds and then pull you forward for a few seconds. And they can be dangerous, especially if it's strong like this one was. You can get pushed into rocks or coral or other divers, which can create chaos, which is a bad thing when you're 80 feet underwater. A lot of us are just trying to make forward progress by gripping onto rock and barnacles, and it felt a little bit like rock climbing underwater until finally we all looked at each other like this is ridiculous and just cut our dive. But unknown to us, one of the buddies had lost their diver who floated out into the blue, and luckily he was able to ascend on his own and was fine, but it felt a little bit like a reality check that nature was sending our way, like, don't get too comfortable. Getting back to the boat, I decided to unwind from that stressful dive with a favorite video game of mine called Dave the Diver. Yeah, I know it's funny that I'm playing a game about scuba diving as I'm out scuba diving, but I wanted to mention it because in the game you can receive emails as your character, and one of the emails I got on this day was an advertisement for me to go visit Cocos Island. In fact, to go diving at the site Alcyone, which we had just been at earlier that day, which was just a wild coincidence. So after weathering the storms above water and the bad conditions underwater, Mother Nature seemed to finally give us her approval. At the halfway point of the trip, the hammerheads were finally starting to warm up to us and swim closer than ever before. As long as we stayed close to the floor and to the reef, the hammerheads were more confident, and some of them even seemed curious about us. I think hammerheads are amazing creatures. Every time I see one, I marvel at how far apart their eyes are and how good their depth perception must be underwater. Also, I've always said that they're the one creature that looks kind of intimidating, but also kind of derpy at the same time. During the second dive of the day, though, suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge black manta swims right by me. I was stunned. I had never seen anything so majestic just flying through the water without a care in the world. It was my first time seeing an oceanic manta, and I didn't even know they came in all black like that. So my mind was just blown, and my whole day was made. I think at this point was when I decided the trip was finally worth it no matter what happened after this. But the highlight of the entire trip came the next morning. We went to the south side of the island, back to the dive site Alcyone. Jacques Cousteau himself discovered this site and named it after his ship at the time. The dive site is what's called a pinnacle. It's basically an underwater plateau at a depth of about 95 feet. There's generally a current at the surface, so the dive plan includes descending along the mooring line so that you don't get blown away. For whatever reason, one of our divers decides to leave the mooring line and just descend straight down. And I look down at her, and there's this big, dark shape moving up behind her and actually hits her with its dorsal fin. And she freaks out. We look at each other like, but nobody else saw it because everybody else was facing into the current. But the whale shark was super friendly and actually swam around Alcyone Pinnacle for our entire dive. It wasn't shy at all. In fact, a few times it would swim in our direction and just expect us to move out of the way. It did not seem to care about us one bit. And it's just awe-inspiring to see something so large just glide effortlessly through the water. I used up a lot of air trying to match its pace a few times, but what a glorious creature. Also, this pinnacle at Alcyone has the most moray eels I've ever seen in one place. Green morays, spotted morays, yellow-edged morays. I mean, we had already seen a lot at other sites, but I must have seen a dozen eels here, and I wasn't even trying to find them. At one point, I was just floating and watching the whale shark, and I looked down, and there was an eel a few feet away from me. And as if that wasn't enough, a couple eagle rays decided to show up as well. So for me, Alcyone was the peak experience at Cocos Island. I had the best time underwater. I was so excited, in fact, that I dropped my GoPro and didn't realize it until I got back onto the dinghy. But so lucky for me, the dive guide from the next dive group going there actually found it on the ocean floor at Alcyone Pinnacle and was able to bring it back to me. And I have never been so excited to get back something that I've lost. One of the bonuses of visiting Cocos Island is getting to go ashore for a little tour. I felt like this was such a privilege because relatively few people over the course of history have ever gotten to step foot on the island. Some of those people made their mark on rocks, with the oldest carvings being pirates and whalers, and a more recent impression from a Cousteau expedition. Defacing the natural rocks is now prohibited, which is probably for the best.
That's nice.
There's also the old ranger station, which is now left as an exhibition. There was a kind of eerie feeling around it. I was just imagining what it would be like to be marooned on this island with no way to get off. It was a real Roanoke colony vibe there. Towards the modern ranger station, we came across some more wildlife, like this hermit crab and a little wild hog. I didn't see any wild deer, although there are many here. They're not indigenous to the island. They were actually brought to the island by sailors who thought, hey, if we're stopping here for fresh water, maybe we can start a deer population and also get some deer meat at the same time. Of course, the sailors are now gone, and the deer remain. They do interfere with the local ecosystem, though, so the Costa Rican government has made several attempts to exterminate them over the years, but have failed. And now no politician wants the blood of a bunch of deer on their hands, so for now, the deer stay. Past the ranger camp is a small river, the Rio Genio, crossed by a bridge that has some unique building materials. Cocos' reputation for sharks has always attracted poachers who like to capture them mostly just for their fins. This bridge is constructed with all the gear that's been confiscated from those poachers by park rangers. Also, I think it looks pretty cool and has a soft little bounce as you walk across it. All the rivers on the island are cool and refreshing, and my skin just welcomed the change from the constant salt water that I was normally in, and it was just nice to hang out in water without a bunch of diving gear on. As we headed back to the shore, I couldn't help daydreaming about what it would be like to live here in this unspoiled paradise of palm trees and papayas, waterfalls and whale sharks. I could live here for a while, and I was a little jealous of the park rangers who do. On the last day of diving, we got to see something pretty special. Huge schools of jacks, bigger than any I'd ever seen before, swirled and swam in these giant formations. Some of these schools were so big they stretched out of view, and some seemed to form up into vague shapes of larger animals. But then, dolphins. A small pod came through, and I noticed them casually swimming through the schools of jacks and occasionally chasing one, but never really trying hard. I thought they were playing with them, but I learned later from our guide that the dolphins aren't interested in the jacks themselves, but they know the jacks have been eating sardines. And so they'll find one that's eaten recently and chase it until it pukes up its sardines, which then becomes a snack for the dolphins. So intelligent, and I guess not really picky eaters. As my trip to Cocos came to a close, I took an inventory of everything I'd seen. I hadn't seen the huge schools of hammerheads and crystal clear water like you see in the brochure, but I had seen enough sharks to make me happy, and the whale shark and the black manta were just the cherries on top. Unfortunately, the Cocos Marine Sanctuary is experiencing a reduction in wildlife and coral. Why this is happening is an active area of research, but it seems to be connected to overfishing, poaching, and climate change. Sadly, it may mean that Cocos' marine wildlife will be less vibrant going forward. I'm glad I got the opportunity to see the island as it is now, still full of life, still as untamed as ever. I haven't seen as many islands as Jacques Cousteau did in his lifetime, but I have to agree, it is the most beautiful island in the world.